Okay, well, that was humbling. Thank you all for waiting. I do see that I haven't lost everyone, and I apologize for the wait. I don't know what was going on today, but my computer was really struggling. I know I have to go out and get some more RAM for it in the coming week, I hope. Just depends on cash flow. But in any case, here we are, and now I will go on. I haven't really looked at your stream of texts here, but I'm glad that you're talking and keeping yourself amused while I'm struggling with my technology. But hopefully I'll be able to get that somewhat resolved in the coming week. Okay, so today I'm going to read the fourth part of Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. This is the first essay in the book by the same title, The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, by C.G. Jung, and it is volume 9I, 9-1, of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And today I'm going to be talking about the Black Magician, among other things, but and therefore I have worn my black shirt, and that's partially in honor of the incredible dream that I had early this morning, which I'm going to tell you about at the end if you're courageous enough to stay on to the end. And so anyway, so this part of this essay, which is paragraph 70 of this book, begins with a dream that a theology student had, and it's a dream that Dr. Jung had available to him, but he did not ever meet this student. And so let me see if I can center myself here. That didn't work too well. And okay. All right. So, paragraph 70. I would like to give you an example of how the unconscious thinks and paves the way for solutions. It is the case of a young theological student whom I did not know personally. He was in great straits because of his religious beliefs, and about this time he dreamed the following dream. And there's a footnote here. I have already used this dream in the phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales, paragraph 398 below, and in Psychology and Education, pages 117 and following, as an example of a big dream without commenting on it more closely. So here's the dream. He was standing in the presence of a handsome old man dressed entirely in black. He knew it was the White Magician. This personage had just addressed him at considerable length, but the dreamer could no longer remember what it was about. He had only retained the closing words, quote, "And for this we need the help of the Black Magician," unquote. At that moment, the door opened, and in came another old man exactly like the first, except that he was dressed in white. He said to the White Magician, quote, "I need your advice," unquote, but threw a sidelong questioning look at the dreamer, whereupon the White Magician answered, quote, "You can speak freely. He is an innocent," unquote. The Black Magician then began to relate his story. He had come from a distant land where something extraordinary had happened. The country was ruled by an old king who felt his death near. He, the king, had sought out a tomb for himself, for there were in that land a great number of tombs from ancient times, and the king had chosen the finest for himself. According to legend, a virgin had been buried in it. The king caused the tomb to be opened in order to get it ready for use, but when the bones it contained were exposed to the light of day, they suddenly took on life and changed into a black horse, which at once fled into the desert and then vanished. The black magician had heard of this story and immediately set forth in pursuit of the horse. After a journey of many days, always on the tracks of the horse, he came to a desert and crossed to the other side, where the grasslands began again. There he met the horse grazing, and there also he came upon the find on whose account he now needed the advice of the white magician about, for he had found the lost keys of paradise, and he did not know what to do with them. In this, unquote, at this exciting moment, the dreamer awoke. Paragraph 72. In the light of our earlier remarks, the meaning of the dream is not hard to guess. The old king is the ruling symbol that wants to go to its eternal rest, and in the very place where similar dominants lie buried. His choice falls, fittingly enough, on the grave of Anima, who lies in the death trance of a sleeping beauty so long as the king is alive. That is, so long as a valid principle, parentheses, prince or princeps. If you're not hearing me or some other problem is happening, please let me know. Let me go. I just had a warning about someone trying to access my computer, so I blocked that. But anyway, going back. Sleeping Beauty, so long as the king is alive, that is, so long as a valid principle, prince or princeps, regulates and expresses life. But when the king draws to his end, he comes to life again and changes into a black horse, which in Plato's parable stands for the unruliness of the passions. Anyone who follows this horse comes into the desert, into a wild land remote from men, an image of spiritual and moral isolation. But there lie the keys of paradise. Now, what is paradise? Clearly the Garden of Eden, with its two-faced tree of life and knowledge and its four streams. In the Christian version, it is also the heavenly city of the Apocalypse, which, like the Garden of Eden, is conceived as a mandala. But the mandala is a symbol of individuation, so it is the black magician who finds the keys to the solution of the problems of belief weighing on the dreamer, the keys that open the way to individuation. The contrast between desert and paradise, therefore, signifies isolation as contrasted with individuation, or the becoming of the self. Paragraph 74. This part of the dream is a remarkable paraphrase of the sayings of Jesus, in which the way to the kingdom of heaven is pointed out by animals, and where we find the admonition, quote, "Therefore know yourselves, for you are the city, and the city is the kingdom," unquote. I'll note that this, the footnote here says that this quote is from the Apocryphal New Testament, pages 27 and following. What the Apocryphal New Testament means is that you will not find it in the Bible. It was excluded from the Bible, and therefore it has been published later in another form, and so you can take it or leave it as to whether it is the word of the Son of God or not. But what Jesus said is, quote, "Therefore know yourselves, for you are the city, and the city is the kingdom," unquote. It is also a paraphrase of the serpent of paradise, who persuaded our first parents to sin, and who finally leads to the redemption of mankind through the Son of God. As we know, this causal nexus gave rise to the ophitic identification of the serpent with the Savior. The black horse and the black magician are half-evil elements whose relativity with respect to good is hinted at in the exchange of garments. The two magicians are, indeed, two aspects of the wise old man, the superior master and teacher, the archetype of the spirit who symbolizes the pre-existent meaning hidden in the chaos of life. He is the father of the soul, and yet the soul, in some miraculous manner, is also his virgin mother, for which... He is the father of the soul, and yet the soul, in some miraculous manner, is also his virgin mother, for which reason he was called by the alchemists the first son of the mother. The black magician and the black horse correspond to the descent into darkness in the dreams mentioned earlier. I'll just take a look at your recent comments. Let me also point out that here in this apocryphal New Testament, Jesus is really pointing out that the kingdom, paradise, and the kingdom of heaven is here. And obviously the church fathers, when they put together the Bible in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, didn't want people to know that. They wanted people to be looking to them for intermediation. They basically were creating an early system of psychotherapy, which is what all religions are. They're naturally developed methods of psychotherapy. But that key sentence there indicates that it was known even at Jesus's time that they were talking about the psyche. Certainly was hidden from me for a very long time. I'm glad to know they're better than ever. Maybe something changed. Who knows? Sean says, God wants to be man, but not quite. Yes, a good quote from Answer to Job. Okay, paragraph 75. What an unbearably hard lesson for a young student of theology. Fortunately, he was not in the least aware that the Father of all prophets had spoken to him in the dream and placed a great secret almost within his grasp. One marvels at the inappropriateness of such occurrences. Why this prodigality? But I have to admit that we do not know how this dream affected the student in the long run, and I must emphasize that to me, at least, the dream had a very great deal to say. It was not allowed to get lost, even though the dreamer did not understand it. Paragraph 76. The old man in this dream is obviously trying to show how good and evil function together, presumably as an answer to the still unresolved moral conflict in the Christian psyche. With this peculiar relativization of opposites, we find ourselves approaching nearer to the ideas of the East, to the nirvana of Hindu philosophy and the freedom from opposites, which is shown as the possible way of solving the conflict through reconciliation. Also Buddhist, I would say. How perilously fraught with meaning this Eastern relativity of good and evil is. I'll read that again. How perilously fraught with meaning this Eastern relativity of good and evil is can be seen from the Indian aphoristic question, quote, who takes longer to reach perfection, the man who loves God or the man who hates him, unquote? The answer is, quote, he who loves God takes 7 reincarnations to reach perfection, and he who hates God takes only 3, for he who hates God will think of him more than he who loves him. For he who hates God will think of him more than he who loves him, unquote. Freedom from opposites presupposes their functional equivalence, and this offends our Christian feelings. Nonetheless, as our dream example shows, the balanced cooperation of moral opposites is a natural truth which has been recognized just as naturally by the East. The clearest example of this is to be found in Taoist philosophy. But in the Christian tradition, too, there are various sayings that come very close to this standpoint. I need only remind you of the parable of the unjust steward. And the parable of the unjust steward, I don't recall, I think it's in Luke, so I don't have the actual citation, but it's the story where Jesus comes upon a man who is working on the Sabbath, and Jesus says to him, if you know what you are doing, you are blessed. If you don't know, you are damned. And so that's like, as I said yesterday, the person who goes to the grocery store and buys things that were once alive, thereby violating the first commandment, thou shalt not kill, because everything in the grocery store has been killed. Paragraph 77. Our dream is by no means unique in this respect, for the tendency to relativize opposites is a notable peculiarity of the unconscious. One must immediately add, however, that this is true only in cases of exaggerated moral sensibility. In other cases, the unconscious can insist just as inexorably on the irreconcilability of the opposites. As a rule, the standpoint of the unconscious is relative to the conscious attitude. We can probably say, therefore, that our dream presupposes the specific beliefs and doubts of a theological consciousness of Protestant persuasion. This limits the statement of the dream to a definite set of problems. But even with this paring down of its validity, the dream clearly demonstrates the superiority of its standpoint. Fittingly enough, it expresses its meaning in the opinion and voice of a wise magician who goes back in direct line to the figure of the medicine man in primitive societies. He is, like the anima, an immortal demon that pierces the chaotic darknesses of brute life with the light of meaning. He is the enlightener, the master and teacher, a psychopomp whose personification even Nietzsche, that breaker of tablets, could not escape, for he had called up his reincarnation in Zarathustra, the lofty spirit of an almost Homeric age, as the carrier and mouthpiece of his own Dionysian enlightenment and ecstasy. For him, God was dead, but the driving demon of wisdom became, as it were, his bodily double. He himself says, quote, Then one was changed into 2, and Zarathustra passed me by, unquote. Paragraph 78. Zarathustra is more for Nietzsche than a poetic figure. He is an involuntary confession, a testament. Nietzsche, too, had lost his way in the darknesses of a life that turned its back upon God and Christianity, and that is why there came to him the revealer and enlightener, the speaking fountainhead of his soul. Here is the source of the hieratic language of Zarathustra, for that is the style of this archetype. Just look at your comments. Mallory, I see your comment, except lobsters. I'm not quite sure of the context. I do know it refers to Jordan Peterson, but anyway. Paragraph 79. Modern man, in experiencing this archetype, comes to know that most ancient form of thinking as an autonomous activity whose object he is, Let me reread that because I didn't read it well. Modern man, in experiencing this archetype, comes to know that most ancient form of thinking as an autonomous activity whose object he is. If the name Lucifer were not prejudicial, it would be a very suitable one for this archetype, but I have been content to call it the archetype of the wise old man, or of meaning. Like all archetypes, it has a positive and a negative aspect, though I don't want to enter into this here. The reader will find a detailed exposition of the two-facedness of the wise old man in the phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales, which is a different essay. Paragraph 80. The three archetypes so far discussed, the shadow, the anima, and the wise old man, are of a kind that can be directly experienced if in personified form. In the foregoing, I tried to indicate the general psychological conditions in which such an experience arises. But what I conveyed here were only abstract generalizations. One could, or rather should, really give a description of the process as it occurs in immediate experience. In the course of this process, the archetypes appear as active personalities in dreams and fantasies. But the process itself involves another class of archetypes, which one could call the archetypes of transformation. They are not personalities, but are typical situations, places, ways and means that symbolize the kind of transformation in question. Like the personalities, these archetypes are true and genuine symbols that cannot be exhaustively interpreted either as signs or as allegories. They are genuine symbols precisely because they are ambiguous, full of half-glimpsed meanings, and in the last resort, inexhaustible. The ground principles of the unconscious are indescribable because of their wealth of reference, although in themselves recognizable. The discriminating intellect naturally keeps on trying to establish their singleness of meaning, and thus misses the essential point. For what we can above all establish as the one thing consistent with their nature is their manifold meaning, their almost limitless wealth of reference, which makes any unilateral formulation impossible. Besides this, they are in principle paradoxical. An old man and a youth at once. Paragraph 81. If one wants a picture of the symbolic process, the series of pictures found in alchemy are good examples, though the symbols they contain are for the most part traditional, despite their often obscure origin and significance. An excellent Eastern example is the tantric chakra system, or the mystical nerve system of Chinese yoga. It also seems as if the set of pictures in the tarot cards were distantly descended from the archetypes of transformation, a view that has been confirmed for me in a very enlightening lecture by Professor Bernoulli. Now, I would say that when he's talking about this, I think he's talking about the minor arcana as process archetypes. The major arcana are more typically personified, and therefore they would be of the former type. Paragraph 82, the symbolic process is an experience in images and of images. Its development usually shows an enantiodromia structure, like the text of the I Ching, and so presents a rhythm of negative and positive, loss and gain, dark and light. Its beginning is almost invariably characterized by one's getting stuck in a blind alley or in some impossible situation, and its goal is, broadly speaking, illumination or higher consciousness, by means of which the initial situation is overcome on a higher level. As regards the time factor, the process may be compressed into a single dream or into a short moment of experience, or it may extend over months and years depending on the nature of the initial situation, the person involved in the process, and the goal to be reached. The wealth of symbols naturally varies enormously from case to case, although everything is experienced in image form, i.e., symbolically. It is by no means a question of fictitious dangers, but of very real risks upon which the fate of a whole life may depend. The chief danger is that of succumbing to the fascinating influence of the archetypes, and this is most likely to happen when the archetypal images are not made conscious. If there is already a predisposition to psychosis, it may even happen that the archetypal figures, which are endowed with a certain autonomy anyway on account of their natural numinosity, will escape from conscious control altogether and become completely independent, thus producing the phenomena of possession. In the case of an anima possession, for instance, the patient will want to change himself into a woman through self-castration, or he is afraid that something of the sort will be done to him by force. The best known example of this is Schreiber's Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Patients often discover a whole anima mythology with numerous archaic motifs. Another patient has described his experiences himself and commented on them in a book. The book is John Custon's Wisdom, Madness, and Folly. I mention these examples because there are still people who think that the archetypes are subjective chimeras of my own brain. Now, what I would say is that when we get into my dream from this morning, you're going to see many of these ideas that he's discussed in this paragraph 82. 83. The things that come to light brutally in insanity remain hidden in the background in neurosis, but they continue to influence consciousness nonetheless. When, therefore, the analysis penetrates the background of conscious phenomena, it discovers the same archetypal figures that activate the deliriums of psychotics. Finally, there is any amount of literary and historical evidence to prove that in the case of these archetypes, we are dealing with normal types of fantasy that occur practically everywhere and not with the monstrous products of insanity. The pathological element does not lie in the existence of these ideas, but in the dissociation of consciousness that can no longer control the unconscious. In all cases of dissociation, it is therefore necessary to integrate the unconscious into consciousness. This is a synthetic process, which I have termed the individuation process. So let me, as a sidelight, say that when you hear my dream, you're going to hear sort of what the risks are. And I have to emphasize Dr. Jung's point that when you're doing an analysis of this type, which I did this morning, which also includes an act of imagination, you have to keep yourself firmly grounded on your real life. And this is where Dr. Jung would come out of his visioning after his evenings with the Red Book period, with his visions, and he would remind himself that he was a doctor, that he had a degree from a Swiss university, that he had a wife and 5 children, that he lived at 228 Seastrasse in Kusnacht, that sort of thing. You have to keep yourself grounded. And as Dr. Edinger emphasized with the idea of the fish in the unconscious, you'll see how these fish come up in my dream, and if they're too much, you have to cut the line and let them go back, because if you don't, they can possess you, and so you have to be very aware of that. Paragraph 84. As a matter of fact, this process follows the natural course of life, a life in which the individual becomes what he always was. Because man has consciousness, a development of this kind does not run smoothly. Often it is varied and disturbed, because consciousness deviates again and again from its archetypal, instinctual foundation, and it finds itself in opposition to it. There then arises the need for synthesis of the two positions. This amounts to psychotherapy even on the primitive level, where it takes the form of restitution ceremonies. As examples, I would mention the identification of the Australian Aborigines with their ancestors in the Alcheringa period, identification with the sons of the sun among the pueblos of Taos, the Helios apotheosis in the Isis mysteries, and so on. Accordingly, the therapeutic method of complex psychology consists on the one hand in making as fully conscious as possible the constellated unconscious contents, and on the other hand in synthesizing them with consciousness through the act of recognition. Since, however, civilized man possesses a high degree of dissociability and makes continual use of it in order to avoid every possible risk, it is by no means a foregone conclusion that recognition will be followed by the appropriate action. On the contrary, we have to reckon with the singular ineffectiveness of recognition and must therefore insist on a meaningful application of it. Recognition by itself does not, as a rule, do this, nor does it imply, as such, any moral strength. In these cases, it becomes very clear how much the cure of neurosis is a moral problem. Paragraph 85. As the archetypes, like all numinous contents, are relatively autonomous, they cannot be integrated simply by rational means, but require a dialectical procedure, a real coming to terms with them, often conducted by the patient in dialogue form, so that without knowing it, he puts into effect the alchemical definition of the meditatio, quote, an inner colloquy with one's angel, unquote. Usually the process runs a dramatic course with many ups and downs. It expresses itself in, is accompanied by dream symbols that are related to the representation collective, which in the form of mythological motifs have portrayed psychic processes of transformation since the earliest times. Paragraph 86. In this short space of a lecture, I must content myself with giving only a few examples of archetypes. I have chosen the ones that play the chief part in an analysis of a masculine psyche, and have tried to give you some idea of the transformation process in which they appear. Since this lecture was first published in Figures of the Shadow, Anima, and Wise Old Man, together with the corresponding figures of the feminine unconscious, have been dealt with in greater detail in my contributions to the symbolism of the self and the individuation process in its relation to alchemical symbolism has also been subjected to closer investigation. And so when he's talking about the symbolism of the self, he's referring to Ion, part 2 of this volume, so volume 9, 2, which is II. And when he's talking about closer investigation of the alchemical symbolism, he's talking about psychology and alchemy, which when I first read that book, my interpretation was that it was basically a history of the human mind or human consciousness. Let me just look at your comments. That's the end of the essay. Mallory says, you said everything at the grocery has been killed. Yes. And Sean says, I had an interesting dream recently where I reflected on it and learned there is a light positive and a light negative. Light positive eradicates the darkness, while light negative only blocks it. They both had different feelings, and that is how I was able to differentiate the light in my dream. Sean says it makes sense to the Mysterium Conjunctionis. The opposites come together without cataclysm. And Mallory says, fascinating. Well, yeah, I suppose if we applied that grocery store test to any of the 10 Commandments, we would find that there is similar relativization. For example, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, Lady Randolph Churchill had a husband who had syphilis. He contracted syphilis on the night before their wedding, and it didn't appear for 3 or 4 weeks, but in that 3 or 4 weeks, she became pregnant with Winston Churchill. But after the syphilis became apparent, she never had sexual relations with her husband again. And so therefore she became quite the woman about town in London. Is that morally right or wrong? Just as an example, but you can take the many examples of Dr. Jung's own life, for example, and many others. So something to think about. Oh, and Mallory says the lobsters aren't dead at the grocery. Okay, fair enough. But then what do you do about thou shalt not kill? Yes, we have a few things that are sold to us from the grocery live, but you're by definition going to kill them before you eat them. And so, okay, now I get into this very interesting and complex dream of mine. And, I am not a mental health professional, so I will not interpret your dreams, anybody else's dreams, but I feel somewhat confident in interpreting my own dreams. And since I thought this dream had a lot in common with the theological student's dream, I thought I would read it to you. And also, what happened was the dream was interrupted. I woke up, and so then I proceeded in an act of imagination, and I will tell you when that happens, and when, and so the dream did continue, and it has a series of changes in it, which are very, very interesting, and so I will read it to you. Sunday morning, 7:50 a.m., March the 24th, 2019. I am in the horse trading business. I am invited to race my horse in a distant event. The trainer is walking my horse with its sculpted... The trainer is walking my white horse with its sculpted musculature along a horizon, and I see it jump very high. It jumps well above where a normal horse can jump, not over a fence, just up in the air. My competition has not seen my horse and has no idea of its power. The race is far away. Then an ex cathedra voice says, "When?" An ex cathedra voice says loudly but uncertainly, "When?" And I make a comment about the voice. The voice has a bit of a warble in it. Okay, so that was all of the dream. But I know that if I just stop and just close my eyes and try to relax myself back into a semi-dream state, I can continue a dream in active imagination. So this is what happened when I did that. Suddenly, I see a troop of black riders on the horizon. It is intimidating. It is intimidating, so I mount my horse. Then the scene changes. Then I am in a new restaurant on its first day of business. All of the black riders come in to eat. I'm worried that we will have enough plates, but the chef smiles at me and holds up a small palm-sized plate, a mandala. But it's white. It's a white plate about the size of my hand, which I later interpreted to be a mandala. And I know these plates will be large enough to feed the black riders. There is an air of conviviality in the restaurant, and I am pleased that the troop of black riders is there on opening day. The restaurant is decorated in a modern way, and the chef is quite stout, but pleasing and trusted. The black riders are glad to be there too. And I put a note on the side here. This is how I've written it all out, so you can see it's not very organized. So the small plates, mandalas, suggest the black riders are in search of spiritual food. Or I put that as a question. And so the question is, do the small plates, mandalas, suggest the black riders are in search of spiritual food, ? Are they my listeners online? A small helping of spiritual food. That's a question to myself. You can make your own judgments. The AI goes on. The black riders are boisterous and start going through the cafeteria-style line. They seem quite happy, even though there doesn't seem to be any physical food present, but the small plates are sufficient. They are in a very happy mood. I put in parentheses then, black riders are shadow complexes within my unconscious who are very happy to be acknowledged and fed. Close parentheses. When I say black writers, I mean black attire. I am not able to fill out any of their features. They are treating me like a hero. I am pleased as I am raised on their shoulders. They shout, hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip, hooray. I realize the black writers are my subscribers from YouTube. I am freeing their dark unconscious complexes, and they are nourishing my soul. And then end of dream. And then my wife opened the blinds and let the light in, and that was the end of that. But anyway, that is the dream. And so it has both a physical world and an unconscious world component to it. The physical world relates to you as my subscribers, and from my point of view, sitting here staring at my webcam, you're quite dark because I can't see you, so I don't know what you look like or anything else, and I don't know how I influence you. And at the same time, I do believe that this relates to certain complexes in myself. I've been going through a period of very intense personal evaluation about what to do about my story that relates back to the last decade. And I've been arguing with myself about what to do with that. And one of the things I've thought about is to write a movie script about it. Whether it ever would be made into a movie is a different question, but just to try to envision it as a movie script in an AI type of format. So I came up with the idea that I might dictate the various scenes of the script as an AI online and just share it with you as I go. And if I do that, I have to decide whether to leave the videos public, and also I have to decide whether to make it public at all or just unlisted. I have made a documentary of the events, which was done in 2015. But then there were quite a few developments after that documentary. That documentary is unlisted, and I have to decide whether to list it. There are moral considerations involved because it involves the efficacy of our entire banking community. And at the time I was going through this, I was very worried about the rule of law as it applies to homeowners. But as I've gone through, and especially since 2015 now, since the time I made that first documentary, we've come to know that the rule of law entirely is at risk in our country. And so right now, as far as I know, the future of the rule of law in the United States is in the hands of the Attorney General and Mr. Rosenstein and Mr. Mueller. And I'm sure their considerations are monumental. Mine are almost no less monumental, because what I found in handling my lawsuit over the last 8 years is that the entire mortgage system of the United States is corrupted, and it's corrupted through the courts, through the land record system, and so on. So it's a very serious issue. And And so I have to decide. One of the things I've had to decide is whether it's better to leave it corrupted and just move on with my life, or make the information that I've uncovered in my lawsuit available to others for possible lawsuits, but also for other possibilities. And the moral considerations of that are huge, because if I just take it upon myself, then that's all well and good. If I make these things public, then there can be hurt to others, and so I have to make that almost the same decision that Messrs. Barr, Rosenstein, and Mueller are making, which is whether to make my information public or not. Now, I have handled my lawsuit entirely by myself, and so I have uncovered some incredible facts, and I have not had a staff like Mr. Mueller had. I've had to do it all by myself, and so I have a big personal moral question that I have to deal with. And so anyway, that's what it's about. And so I'll look at your comments if there are any others. And so I guess the further comment then is these black riders on the horizon. In my own active imagination, I was quite intimidated when I saw this troop of black riders across the horizon, maybe 20 of them or more, and they were coming toward me. So even at that point of the active imagination, I had to make a decision about whether I was going to be able to handle that fish. Okay, let's think about this in the context of fishing, because as Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger were talking about this, when you bring up things from the unconscious, sometimes they can be more than you can handle. And obviously, from my point of view, the white horse, with all its power, represents instinct and trying to control that instinct, and what it might mean to the people that are in the race, distant race. So that was just the dream itself. Then when I started the active imagination, the first thing that happened was I saw this troop of riders on the horizon, and they're coming toward me, and they're all in black. And so from a psychological point of view, I can see those riders as my complexes and some of the many issues that I have to consider in my lawsuit. So those are there working in my unconscious all the time. And so at that point in the active imagination, which was only a minute or so into the active imagination, I see this line of riders on the horizon in silhouette, and they're coming toward me. It was quite an intimidating scene. And so I had to make a decision right there whether I should cut that line and let that fish get away, or whether I should continue on. And so I made the decision to continue on with the active imagination, believing that I could see what happened and be able to understand it myself, be able to integrate it myself, which I pretty much have, I think. And just at that moment where I made the decision to allow the active imagination to continue, then I fell into the restaurant. And I'm worried about these black riders coming into my restaurant, my new restaurant, and I see the chef across the room holding up the small white plate, which represented a mandala. And so I then had to decide still, because the black riders are coming into the restaurant where everything is okay, and the chef shows me the small mandala, the small plate that we had, and basically says to me it's okay. Now I take that chef to represent the self, and a communication to me that it was okay to continue, which I did continue. And then the black riders come in, and it's all very convivial, and it has this nice ending to it. But it might not have been that. It might have been something much, much different. And so if you ever think about doing this sort of thing where you continue a dream, you should be conscious that sometimes these things can get away from you, and that's where you have to make the decision to cut the line or not. And because, as Dr. Jung was explaining in this reading, in this fourth part of the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, if the fish is too big for your boat, you can be swamped, and it can turn into a psychosis. So in my view, and this is my layman's view, I'm an informed layman, but I don't know enough about mental health. So what I would urge is that if ever you try to do something like what I've done, and I've got a lot of experience with this, so I more or less know what I'm doing, I would urge you that if things seem to be getting out of hand in your active imagination, you should cut the line and let it go away. Go back into the sea, as it were. So anyway, that's my thought. Let's see. And so, let's see. Sean says, did you feel a system at work during the dream? No, I simply saw the image of the horse jumping, the white horse being brought along by the trainer and jumping up. It jumped very high, like 10 or 12 feet, which is obviously more than a living horse can do. And then I woke up. This whole black rider scenario came up entirely in my active imagination. Mallory says martyrdom. I'm not sure about martyrdom, but maybe. Sean says something like that doesn't surprise me, and there are plenty of those crossroad demons waiting near those rules of law. Absolutely, absolutely. And while evil is getting strong and the riverbeds deepen, so does the good or light increase in potency. Yes, absolutely. So the question is, how do we make a conscious moral decision? And Mallory says, as a high intuitive, do you think you are neglecting the potential of becoming a target, both as an educator and with your lawsuit? No, I certainly am not neglecting the potential of becoming a target. I certainly know that if I start a process with respect to this lawsuit, I will certainly become a target, and in one way or another. And so I have been, because there are very, very large considerations involved. I mean, what I discovered, in my opinion, and I'm somewhat knowledgeable in the sense that I'm an attorney, and I now have the experience of having been through this lawsuit for 8 years. And I have an MBA, so I know something about the financial aspects of the case and what happens in lawsuit in Wall Street and what happens in mortgage-backed securities, for example. And I have been obviously studying it very heavily for many years. And so, in my opinion, the financial industry has subverted the entire rule of law as it relates to the mortgage industry. And the case really goes to every courthouse and probably more or less every financial institution in the country. So it's not like it's little. The only reason I haven't pushed it out more, in part, is because the president has sucked all the air out of the room. I used to think that the case that I've now proven on the record, all the facts are on the record, and I put them there intentionally for this purpose. So the case that I've proven on the record, in my opinion, is potentially bigger than Watergate. And but at this point, I know that it's a fish that's bigger than my boat. And so I really have to decide how to bring it forward and how to minimize the risk to my personal life. And so that is a huge moral consideration in many ways. I mean, it relates both to my wife and my mother-in-law and my immediate family, but it also relates to all of us in the United States, depending on how it plays out. Sean says, I agree completely, and it's very hard to articulate what you just said without sounding like a psycho. Yep, absolutely. And so I'm going to be working that through. And I have been thinking about it for quite a long time, as you might guess. Miles says, important not to have too many lines out at the same time. I am pulling a bunch back in. Too many to attend to in the world of the internet. Too much is my feeling at times, too easy to connect. And Mallory says, just concerned for your well-being. Well, I thank you for that. And, I'm still mulling how to deal with the overall situation. It's obviously been kept quiet by the Maryland judiciary and by the foreclosure bar in the state of Maryland up until now, and also by the federal judiciary here in Maryland. And it's a true irony that all foreclosure cases went to the one federal judge in Maryland who used to be the chairman of the Republican Party in the state of Maryland, if you can imagine. He's handled apparently several thousand foreclosure cases in the federal court, and so these are big enough issues, and I still am thinking about how to tell my story, not only on this this channel, but also whether to even release the documentary that I already prepared in 2015. That documentary is on YouTube already, although it's unlisted, and it's on a different channel, so you won't find it easily unless I release it. Mallory said, would I mind describing anima possession in men? Well, sure, that's very easy. If you see a woman and all of a sudden you have to have that woman, or you have to connect with that woman. That's your anima telling you that's the woman for you. And if you don't recognize that that's your anima, so it's an instinctual reaction to that woman, you can do some stupid things. And obviously lots of men do stupid things, getting involved with other women other than their wives, and that sort of thing. So if you're if you're married to someone and you have an anima position, then that would be another woman who you say, oh my God, I have to have that woman. And so you start doing things on the side that ultimately destroy your marriage. That's an anima possession. And Mallory says, Sean says, great question. Tor says, Mallory second, that sounds interesting. Afternoon all, says Martin. Okay, so that was anima possession. And so I think I've probably given enough interesting information on this video, so I should move on. And I thank you all for being here. And Miles says, deferred prosecution agreements for too big to fail corporations for virtual get out of jail free cards are now available in Canada too, unfortunately. Puts little people at a great disadvantage. Yeah. We all have a big problem in how our national finances operated, and that's the issue that I have to address here. But anyway, so peace. I'm going to log off, and thank you for being with me today. I'll be online, by the way, tomorrow at 8, as usual.